Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring your curiosity because here you will find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner with the Duluth News Tribune, and I will be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we look at how a roadside fairyland led to a museum of doll dioramas in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. To take us through the Story Art and Museum, I'm joined again by arts and entertainment reporter Jay Gabler. Jay, welcome back to the Northlandia podcast.
Thanks, Wyatt. Always an honor, always a privilege.
Yeah, so last time you were here, we were talking about train boxcars that you could spend the night in along the North Shore, but this time we headed west to Grand Rapids to talk about a fairytale doll collection. I guess first tell us, how did we end up there?
Yeah, this one is not an Airbnb yet, but someday, who knows? Well, I've previously written about the Judy Garland Museum in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. So when I heard that there's a new museum of old dolls in Grand Rapids, I wondered, well, are these two connected? I wanted to learn more about how it came to be that there's this museum of dolls from fairy tales and other classic stories in Grand Rapids. It turns out there are some touch points, but these are two very different organizations with two very different histories.
Yeah, so I guess talk to you about what is the Story Art and Museum.
It's a two-room institution located in former classrooms on the second story of the old Central School, a historic building right in the middle of Grand Rapids that's now used for a variety of community tenants. It includes one room that's sort of used as a community gathering space. There's play space for kids. It's available for all sorts of different community uses. There's another communal space they can use for music performances, so you can have events there and just kind of hang out. But then there's one room that's dedicated to dozens and dozens of handmade dolls. Each of these dolls is about the size of an American Girl doll for a sort of sense of scale there. And that's not a coincidence because these dolls were all made by an artist, a Minnesota artist named Faith Wick. She made them from the 1970s on until the early 21st century. Faith's story is fascinating. It goes back quite a ways. She's now 92 years old, living in Cohasset, and she learned to sew from her grandmother, who was a Finnish immigrant. And from a very early age, Faith loved to sew, to make dolls, to play make-believe. This was always an interest of hers. But she really got to take it to the next level in the 1960s when she and her then husband, Mel Wick, bought Fairyland Park near Marble, Minnesota.
And it started by Myrtle Gustafson in 1948. So Myrtle Gustafson and her friends, her other ladies in the community, started this park with life-size fairy tale figures and historic figures on a path through the woods, and they called it Fairyland Park. It was definitely my mom's idea, and my dad was working in the mines, and he could build and repair anything. So they operated it as a summer business. At the start, there were about 5,000 visitors a summer, 10,000 visitors a summer through the 60s and early 70s.
That's the voice of Heidi Wick, who's the executive director of Story Art and Museum. She's one of 4 children that Faith and Mel Wick had. And as she was saying, she grew up at Fairyland Park and has really played a significant role in preserving her mom's legacy and putting this museum together as a place where people can visit and see all these many figures that her mom made, which is, by the way, just a small fraction of the total work that Faith Wick has created over the course of her career.
If I remember correctly, she's been putting this collection together for like over a decade now or around.
Yeah, so Faith Wick has made perhaps hundreds of different doll designs over the course of her career and kept many of them, at least one copy. They were often made in limited editions. She would work with sort of contractor artisans across the country who would make different parts of the dolls, and then they'd sort of work to assemble these handmade dolls. And so then Faith would keep, one or more of each doll that she made, and eventually started to think, although the dolls were originally made to be sold to collectors, she started to have dioramas made to display these dolls who are typically based on fairy tale characters or nursery rhyme characters in a setting that sort of tells the story of their nursery rhyme. And so she started to display those characters in those dioramas when she and her husband were living in Florida. They later moved, which they'd kind of done because snowbirding from northern Minnesota, understandable. Anyway, she and her husband later moved to Ohio and brought the figures with them, and then finally moved back up to northern Minnesota. And first displayed the characters in Minnesota at the Judy Garland Museum. So here's where we come to the Judy Garland Museum. For many years, from 2005 until 2021, they were, at least a selection of them, were on display at the Judy Garland Museum. So some people might remember seeing those dolls there, but then the museum wanted to make more play space for kids, and so they returned those dolls, the dioramas, to the Wick family. And that was the point at which Heidi Wick started thinking, we should really do this right, create an independent nonprofit, and create a way for us to display all these dolls we have, or at least a larger number of them, including the ones that had been in the Judy Garland Museum, plus some that the family had kept in their personal collection. And so that was what ultimately led to the Story Art Museum, which is now a 501c3 nonprofit.
So let's talk about the museum itself. So you walk through the doors of Old Central School and go walk up the steps to the first floor, and you walk through the hallway, and what's the first thing you see when you walk through and then walk through the space?
Well, the first thing you see is a place to hang your coat at a conveniently low level, because this was originally a fifth grade classroom. So you kind of walk through the coat room and you know you're in an old school classroom. And this also, by the way, is the same room where the Judy Garland Museum got its start, back when it was just one room of one person's Judy Garland collectibles. This was the room it was in. Of course, now they have a much larger freestanding space, but this is the history of this space. So it's very apt that these dolls are on display in this space. And yes, you walk into the space and you see, just imagine like an old like grade school classroom, but just absolutely stuffed with rows and rows and sort of twisting corridors of these dioramas, these display cases, these shelves with hundreds of these dolls that were created by Faith Wick. Mostly dolls from fairy tales, from nursery rhymes. When you walk through, you'll see characters you might not have thought about since you were a little kid, you know, reading or having nursery rhymes read to you. A lot of the classic Mother Goose stories, Hans Christian Andersen, you name it. And so all these like classic story characters are all around you. And at first you think, boy, this is kind of a, you know, quirky collection, but whether or not you want to regard it as quirky, these are really valuable works of art that when they were first made would retail for the equivalent of $1,000 to $5,000 in today's money. So these are very valuable collector's items and quite a collection that have all come together in this room.
This figure here, this is Hansel and Gretel and the witch and of course her candy house. This will take us back to Fairyland Park. So most people who visit Fairyland will remember the witch. And the witch talked. And for some of the time, the witch actually could talk personally to you and know your name and maybe the name of your pet or the name of your sister or your brother. So it was traumatizing for some children to go visit Fairyland and meet the witch. Later on, the witch was a recorded reel-to-reel tape, a magnetic tape.
So speaking of Fairyland, how did Faith go from making life-size figures for the park to the more miniature dolls that we are seeing now?
So the family owned Fairyland Park from 1960 until the early 70s, and it was already a little retro even when the Wicks bought it in 1960. It had been founded a dozen years ago by a woman named Myrtle Gustafson. It's kind of one of these retro mid-century attractions with, life-size fairy tale characters, and there were some U.S. presidents. It was kind of like, you know, an oddity, although Faith preferred not to refer to it that way. She preferred to highlight the power of story and the art behind that experience. But eventually, you can't necessarily run essentially a roadside attraction forever. If you're a family, you have other things to concern yourself with. But when they did decide to let go of Fairyland Park, Faith realized, Heidi told us, that she really loved the process of making these figures, telling these stories through original creations. And so instead of making life-size fairy tale characters that would be on display in an attraction you would pay to go see, she had the technology at that point and the materials to work on a slightly smaller scale and make these dolls that are a little bit, more accessible size-wise to create, but then you could also share with people by selling them or, in this case, putting them on display in a different context. I also asked Heidi, how is it that these classic stories still have this enduring power and appeal to people now that, we have video games and smartphones and TV and you can listen to whatever you want as a podcast or what have you? Why do people keep being drawn back to these classic stories? And she said, you know what, there are themes in these stories that are still resonant that people really connect with to this day. And she's seen evidence of that among the visitors to the museum.
One young lad, he had fallen when he was 5 or 6 and hurt his head and had lots of stitches. And they went to the Judy Garland Museum, and there was Humpty Dumpty, fell off the wall. He's got stitches in his head. So they took a picture of him next to Humpty Dumpty. Well, Humpty Dumpty moved a couple years ago, and he came back as a teenager 18 years old, and he wanted to get a picture of himself with Humpty Dumpty. So he found us. Like, where did he go? And he's coming back twice. So he comes back to see the museum, and he related to Humpty Dumpty.
Well, walking through the museum, you can definitely see a plethora of classic tales that you can draw back to, something even I had forgotten about, that as soon as it's like, oh, that's right, that's from Pinocchio, or that's from Rumpelstiltskin, Pippi Longstocking, The Three Bears, Little Boy Blue, Peter Pan. But beyond the classic fairy tale stuff, she also has some clowns that she had made. Heidi talked about how it's from an era before clowns got kind of scary. In the horror genre now, clowns kind of have that negative association, so they're more in the happy, fun kind of light. And then there was one clown in particular that had a special history to it.
Yeah, she was going through all the different clowns and pointing out these are really specific characters from circus history, and Faith was really sort of exploring that history and paying tribute to some of the classic clown designs throughout history. And then she got to one and said that the face resembled a president, a past president of the United States, who we learned Faithwick actually met.
This one here is a clown with masks, and a thespian, they call him, a theater clown. And actually, if you look carefully, his face looks like Gerald Ford. In 1976, I believe, Faith was a Minnesota Mother Artist of the Year and traveled with 50 other Mother Artists of the Year, plus 50 other Mothers of the Year from every state, and went to meet Gerald Ford at the White House. And so she made a doll of Gerald Ford. Afterwards, then she made him into a clown.
So while we were visiting the Story Art Museum, we got to speak with Heidi, got the tour, but we weren't able to actually get to meet and speak with Faith in person. She wasn't able to come and meet us there. But you got to have a separate phone call with her later, so tell me about that.
Yeah, I spoke briefly with Faith by phone. She's 92, so she's lived a long and productive life and is living happily in Cohasset, where apparently she loves to play bananagrams and visit with family. So we just spoke briefly on the phone, and she just expressed to me that she was happy to have her collection in this really nice new museum setting that her daughter Heidi has set up.
Yeah, even though it's very apparent how much work that Faith has put into these pieces, especially considering this is only a small portion of it, you looking around, you can't help but also acknowledge how much work Heidi put into curating all of this. And it's a lot of work, especially in the form of a nonprofit. Of course, then I figured I needed to ask why it was so important for her to be doing this, and she said that it was an emotional question for her.
I grew up at Fairyland. I was born in 1961. My parents bought Fairyland in 1960. My name's Heidi. So my mom is currently 92, and we've been sharing the story Heidi, and I'm so much like Heidi from the story. I just want to share and heal, and there's a lot of mental illness. There's a lot of places people don't have to go, and there's so much in story that we can use to travel here, travel there, share our pain. And you might ask, what motivated Faith to create this? Well, this is 5% of what she did. This is just as a drop in the bucket. So she did it because it was a healing for herself as well.
So this story about fairy tale inspired dolls isn't exactly a story that screams Northland, but yet it kind of belongs to the Northland.
Absolutely. I think it's a story of Northland creativity, ingenuity, persistence, the work ethic. Faithwick's husband, Mel, was a miner. He would go to work in the mines and mine iron ore or whatever else needed to be dug out of the ground. And we talk a lot about the labor of those miners, which as we well should in this region and up on the range. But he would come home and help the family run Fairyland Park. And I think it's also important to talk about the labor of Faithwick, who worked so hard to create and maintain this attraction for the community, to teach. She worked as an educator throughout her career to raise her kids and to design these figures that didn't just bring joy to people in the community and the family and visitors to the museum now, but were sold across the country and around the world. She used to tour across the country, and it was like a celebrity was coming to town. They would have VIP receptions, and people would line up to have her sign, examples of her work. And she would sort of dress in themed costumes, and she became an important part of this collectible doll movement in the 70s and 80s that presaged the American Girl doll explosion in the 80s and 90s. So if you have ever had or appreciated or known someone who has loved an American Girl, a little piece of that legacy, actually more than a little piece of that legacy of collectible dolls in the U.S., traces back to Faithwick. So when you go to see this collection in Grand Rapids, you're not just seeing a piece of community history, of family history, but of the history of collectible dolls and storytelling in the United States. Heidi Wick actually sent a piece of audio to share with us that was recorded of her mother, Faith Wick, in 2021 when Faith visited a previous version of the museum when it was in a different Grand Rapids space before it moved to the school. I think when you listen to Faith talk about looking at her work after all these decades of her life and legacy creating these figures, you really hear how this is in her bones, this passion for this art.
So what do you think of seeing all the things you made here?
Amazing. Isn't that crazy that I don't remember making them, but they looked so familiar that I thought, I could do that. And I didn't realize I did do it. It's nuts.
Well, Jay, I can't think of a better place to end it, so I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks again for joining us. Can't wait to see where we end up next time when you return to Northlandia.
Thanks, Wyatt. I'm excited to see too.
And thank you for joining us on this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, as well as see photos and video produced by myself, visit duluthnewstribune.com/topics/Northlandia. Next week, we're joined again by News Tribune reporter Joe Bowen, who takes us back up the North Shore inside the 3M Birthplace Museum. You can find all of our episodes of Northlandia on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you or someone you know has a unique story that you believe could have a place here in Northlandia, let us know by emailing northlandia@duluthnews.com. Join us again next week and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss if you're not in the right place at the right time, ready to step off the beaten path with no rush to return, here in Northlandia.